Hello, and welcome to episode 6 of Sir Astro's The Lord of the Rings painting series. In this episode, we're going to paint Aragorn from Fantasy Flight Games' The Lord of the Rings Journeys in Middle-earth. With his dark green cloak and dark hair flecked with grey, I've taken inspiration from the book and aimed to give Aragorn quite a rough and weather-beaten appearance. As with the rest of the figures, I'll be sticking to using mostly paints from Vallejo's Basic Colours paint set, with the exception of some dark sea blue and some ivory. Let's take a look at the painting stages. As usual, I've primed the figure in black, followed with some grey and white zenithal highlights applied from above, although a plain prime in grey or white would also be fine. I'll then be applying the base colours, and I've chosen a lighter green tone for the tunic to contrast with the cloak, along with some leather of black and dark brown. We can then apply a couple of shades to darken the recesses for select areas, especially where there are lots of creases and folds. Finally, we'll add some highlights, and along the way I'll be creating some rough and battle-worn textures, having some fun with the sword, and adding plenty of muddy weathering, before adding some scenery to the base. Let's begin with the base colours. I'm going to begin by painting the cloak by mixing some black into some flat green. I'm applying a single fairly opaque layer of this. For the tunic, I've chosen to use the same colour I used for Legolas, which means refractive green mixed with a little clear orange. This gives us adequate contrast against the cloak and also the dark leather elements we'll be painting in a moment. Just as with Legolas, you may choose to paint the trim in a different colour. I've chosen to paint some of the leather items in black, using a roughly equal mix of black and dark sea blue. Alternatively, you could mix some flat green and flat blue into some black. I'm using this for the boots, bracers, sword grip, and the strap that runs across the chest. For the belt and sword sheath, I'm using an equal mix of black and flat brown. I've also chosen to use this for the trousers. For all of the areas of metal, I'm using silver mixed with a roughly equal black and dark sea blue mix. As well as the weapons, this will include the clasp on the cloak, the fastenings on the tunic, and the belt buckle. Next I'm going to paint the skin using flat flesh mixed with a little flat red and flat brown. I'm gradually adding small amounts of the red and the brown until I have a tone I'm happy with, that shouldn't look too out of place compared to my own skin tone. At this point I've chosen to paint the eyes with a dab of ivory. Alternatively, you could mix some buff into some white, and of course it's always worth mentioning that the eyes really don't have to be painted at all to achieve a good tabletop standard. I'm now dotting in some pupils with a black and dark sea blue mix, which again is a very optional touch. Finally, I'm also using this to paint the hair. Let's now add some shade. I'm going to begin by shading the tunic using some Athonian camo shade, thinned down with anything up to an equal amount of Lahmian medium. Next I'm going to mix some Nuln Oil and Agrax Earthshade, which I'm once again thinning with some medium. And I'm using this for all of the areas of brown. Next I'm going to thin some Reikland Flesh Shade for the skin. This helps add some definition to the fingers, but I'm using it more selectively for the face, taking care not to fill in the eyes. Finally, I've chosen to use an equal mix of Celia Green Shade, Nuln Oil and medium to darken the shadows and recesses on the cloak. This is fairly optional, however, as the cloak is already pretty dark. With that done, we're ready to add some highlights and finishing touches. I'm going to begin by highlighting the cloak using the original flat green and black mix, but with just a little less of the black. You can see that this is just a little brighter and more saturated than the base tone. I'm naturally focusing on the upper half of the cloak, where we have lots of raised ridges and upturned areas facing the light. I'm now going to lighten this with some buff in a few stages. this is my brightest tone. You'll see for highlights like this that I'll often withdraw the brush quite quickly to achieve a tapered finish to the stroke. Next I'm going to highlight the tunic by adding some yellow ochre to the original refractive green and clear orange base tone in a couple of stages. There are a couple of rough spots on the miniature where I had a hard time cleanly removing some of the mould lines, but I'll be disguising some of these with some weathering later on. I'm now moving on to the skin, where I'm using the original skin tone mix but with slightly more of the flat flesh. I'm now mixing in some additional flat flesh along with a little white, partly to control the saturation as I find the flat flesh on its own a little too orange. I don't mind a slightly rougher texture for Aragorn compared to the skin tone I created for Legolas or the other elves in the game. I'm now lightening this further with some additional white. Here, along with the white, I'm also mixing in just a little flat green to add to the luminosity of these final highlights. Next I'm moving on to the black leather, where I'm going to simply add white to the original black and dark sea blue base tone in a few stages. Unlike with the cloak, I'll be aiming for a rougher, more textured finish, and will be working fairly quickly. I'm certainly not being too precious with the boots, as I'll be applying a fair bit of mud here later on. I'm now beginning to add some scratchy textures, especially for the strap on the chest. Here I'm thinning down some black, which I'm using to tone down and integrate some of the highlights that have gone a little too far. We can also use some of these grey tones to add a few highlights to the hair. And here I'm drawing in some eyebrows, keeping the strokes as narrow as I can. Next I'm going to highlight the brown leather by mixing some yellow ochre into the brown and black base tone. I'm now applying some Agrax Earthshade to help blend the tones and create a more multi-layered effect. Once dry, we can add some additional highlights on top, and I'm mixing in some buff for these to prevent the mix from becoming too yellow. And here I'm using some pure buff for my final brightest highlights. I'm now going to paint the sword, and I'll be aiming for a semi-metallic, somewhat stylized look. For that, I'm going to create a fresh mid-tone using a mix of dark sea blue and silver. I'll then be creating a shadow tone by mixing in some black, and a highlight tone by mixing in some white. Here's the dark sea blue and silver mix. I'm now creating the shadow tone by mixing it with the black. And now the highlight tone by mixing it with the white. I'm going to begin by mixing the mid and highlight tones, and I'm using this to block in a highlight on the upper half of one side of the blade. I'm then using some of the mid-tone to create a quick transition whilst the paint is still wet. I'm now doing the same for the other half of the front of the blade, except I'm placing the highlight at the bottom instead. I'm once again using the mid-tone to create a quick transition in the middle of the blade. Next I'm going to mix the mid and dark tones and use this to push the depth at the darker end of each gradient. If necessary, we can use some of the intermediate tones to help smooth the transitions. And I'll also often use a damp brush to help blend the tones on the miniature. I'm creating a similar layout of highlight and shade on the reverse. I'm now pushing the contrast by using the pure shadow tone for the very ends of each gradient. And we can also do the same for the lighter ends using the pure highlight tone. I'm also adding some small notches and scratches with this. And the same tones can be used for the crossguard. I'm now going to boost the contrast further by mixing some ivory into the highlight tone. Notice that the warmer tone of the ivory contrasts nicely with the cooler bluish tones we've been using so far. I'm also using this to provide some edge highlighting using the side of the brush tip. If possible, I also want to get a thin highlight on the central ridge. Here I'm mixing some silver into some pure ivory for my brightest highlight. And here I'm adding a few final scratches. I'm now using the same tones for the dagger, although there's less room to play with the reflections. We can also use these tones for the other metallic details. With the metallics complete, I've chosen to give a subtle yellow boost to the highlights on the cloak. So I'm adding some yellow ochre to the green and black base tone. This could have been done during the highlighting earlier, of course, but it's sometimes only when most of the colours are in place that a few minor adjustments suggest themselves in the interest of overall colour balance. I'm now mixing some buff into some flat brown and a little black. And I'm using this to create my first layer of muddy weathering. For rough stippling like this, I'd suggest using an old brush. Naturally, I'm focusing on the lower portion of the cloak as well as the boots, but I'm also providing some smaller bits of mud splatter higher up the figure too. I'm now adding some lighter layers by mixing in some additional buff. You can see that I'm loosely following the pattern of highlights on the cloak as I apply these lighter tones. Here I've also chosen to mix in a little yellow ochre. This can also be applied very thinly like a glaze to help tie things together. Now that I'm happy with the weathering, I'm going to prepare the base exactly as described in the previous episodes, by firstly using Vallejo's Dark Earth basing paste along with a couple of cork rocks. I'm following this with a light dry brush and then some brown shade. And finally I'm gluing down some tufts of grass. And this completes Aragorn. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have enjoyed the episode. Please note as always that you will find a full product list in the video description, along with links to where I can be reached on a range of social media platforms. My sincerest thanks go to the wonderful patrons who are so kindly funding these videos. If you'd like to help support my work, do please consider hitting the Patreon link and pledging what you can. Join me again soon as we continue painting miniatures from The Lord of the Rings: Journeys in Middle-earth. Happy painting!